Thank you very much. Yeah, the start of this came as a sort of I got a proposition, I guess, to make as part of this presentation, which is that actually cars are a problem. We know they've been a problem for many years, but the solutions that we create to deal with that problem are actually much more damaging than the cars themselves. So I'm going to start with a terrible example of traffic in a city, which led to incredibly high death rates, huge amounts of pollution, and which this apparently works like that. There we go. This is a terrible example of traffic in a historic town. And one of the things that we need to realise is that the Romans probably worried about traffic. Traffic has always been an issue in our towns. We've always had too much of it. Actually, traffic is a symptom of success. And when cities are successful, they become busy, and when they become busy, they become traffic. And whether we're dealing with cars or buses or horse-drawn carriages or chariots, I think it's always been an issue. And I'd ask you to think for a moment about what the streets look like without traffic. Because I was in Jaipur just before Christmas. And one of the things they do in the pink city of Jaipur, which is absolutely beautiful, is they take you out at 6 o'clock in the morning to do the pink city walk. So you walk through Jaipur, and it's weird because there's no traffic. And this is what Jaipur normally looks like. And actually, take the traffic out, and all of a sudden it's a museum piece. It isn't a living city. It's the same in Chinese cities. This is Chengdu, where I was the year before. And the problem with this is you've got an economy where people essentially used to travel around by bike or tuk-tuk or you know, basically pedal power, which have now converted into diesel power in a fairly short period of time. And you have the same level of confusion and congestion. But actually, the extraordinary thing going around Indian cities in the back of a tuk-tuk is how it all works. How this incredibly complex spatial negotiation takes place without seeming traffic regulations, and okay, with a fairly significant death rate. It's true. In this situation, it's all could ground to a halt, so it's probably quite safe. But the question is, you know, how do we respond to that? And when cities get to the point of Jaipur or Oxford, I mean, let's take either, and you get to the point where the streets are full, what do? The first thing you can do, this is the edge of Jaipur, is you stop growing. Now, very few cities in history have ever purposely decided to stop growing. It's just not what a city does. The reality is if a city stops growing, it starts declining, and that's not a good thing. And so stopping growing is something which is forced on some places when you get to the limits of your transport capacity. But not something people tend to do by choice. The second thing is to build more roads. This is also Jaipur. And building more roads is a false economy, essentially. You can start building more roads, you'll solve the problem for a short period of time, but the problem with roads is that they make it easier to get around, and therefore they generate more traffic. And so the history of roads, right the way back from the early days of Los Angeles, is the more roads you build, the more traffic you get, and the traffic fills up the road, then you need more roads. And so you're onto a treadmill which you're never going to get off. The third response is to build public transport. This isn't Jaipur. I think is this Jaipur? I didn't see this when I was there. It might be Ahmedabad. And Indian cities are at this point at the moment where they're just building public transport, and it will allow them to get to the next stage of their growth. So the issue is, how do you deal with movement? How do you deal with busyness? And this, I've become a fan of Pinterest recently, and this came up on Pinterest, which I thought was a really interesting way of looking at it. So if you take people walking, you can accommodate about 17,000 person movements per hour, and the primary fuel is food. If you're on a bike, you can get 14,000 vehicle movements an hour. If you use cars, then you only get 4,000 vehicle movements an hour, and obviously the fuel is oil. A bus, 52,000, and a tram, 66,000. And so all of a sudden you can see the way to make historic cities work in terms of movement is not to stop them growing, not to stop them moving around, but to actually do it more efficiently. And that's generally done through public transport. So it's not so much death by car as death by a highway engineer. I thought I'm fairly safe in this room that we won't have any highway engineers. I'm always rude about fire engineers. And to be honest, the stuff that I've got a strange sort of attachment to the stuff that Richard was showing, but actually it is also awful, isn't it? I mean, in terms of any sort of civilized street life that we enjoy in a city, that idea of vehicle separation and so on is pretty awful. So in terms of the way the car has affected us, and at the Academy of Urbanism, we do a column in our journal called The Urban Idiot, and it's about good things done with good intentions which have gone horribly wrong, and they almost all revolve around the car. It's amazing how many of them, from sort of neighbourhood units to Radburn layouts and so on, all revolve around dealing with the car, because this is the growth in car ownership. These are UK figures. The American figures are the same, but just slightly brought forward, because the Americans started taking on car ownership about 20 years earlier than us, and obviously went up more steeply. The last 2 years, I've actually sort of on this map are actually levelling out. And I talked to highway engineers that think we might have got to peak car, as in we've got to the point where certainly in cities people are no longer seeing 2 or 3 cars as being essential to any family, but actually reducing their car ownership to a single car per household. And also things like, the actual driving license, ownership of young men under 26 has fallen quite dramatically in the last few years, simply because it's just so expensive to get insured. So we might have got to peak car ownership, but possibly not. So the first stage of the car was all about this new technology, and this is obviously a garden city, and what's interesting about this drawing, which you don't notice at first, is, well, first of all, there's no cars, but there are no driveways, but there's still quite a big road. And of course we had roads before we had cars, because the roads were for the carriages and for the milkmen and for the coalmen and so on. It was the thing where you got around. So just because you don't have cars doesn't mean you don't have roads. So at the first stage of the car was developing that. Now, the law is that any talk about highway engineering has to include this picture. I think there is a law about that, isn't there? From Buchanan. And again, as Richard said, that Buchanan actually said, if car ownership carries on as it is going at the moment, this is what we're going to have to do. He said it was an option to try and reduce car ownership, and we wouldn't have to do any of that stuff. But actually, if you're going to carry on, this is what you're going to have to do. And this second age of the car is all about turning our cities inside out in order to cope with this massive growth of car ownership. And there's Radburn in America, which is from the 1930s, where you turn around the whole organisation of a housing estate so that you have car at the front and pedestrian at the back, and you can move around the entire estate without coming in contact with any of these vehicles. Because the interesting thing is that 1920s and 30s in America, the death rate from cars was huge. Far higher per vehicle than we have at the moment, partly because of safety features and so on. But 1 child a day was being killed in New York by cars at one point before the Second World War. And so there was this mass panic about how awful cars were and how we needed to not stop cars, obviously that was important to keep them going, but to change the whole city in order to accommodate them. The third age of the car, which is quite recent, so it probably dates back to the 90s, particularly sort of New Labour, John Prescott and so on, was to say, actually we should reorganise our cities to reduce car ownership. And so it all feels like history now, PPG 3, PPG 6 or PPG 13 as well, all those planning policies which are basically saying increased density, increased walkability, and the number of cars will fall because people can walk rather than drive. Well, the car ownership figures say it didn't work. Because actually car ownership carried on going up through this process, despite John Prescott saying that it would be coming down by the end of his administration. I think it was worth a try, but actually when you look at stuff, and actually this study I'm showing, these slides are from a thing called Parking Space, which tested this hypothesis about whether denser housing schemes led to lower car ownership. And whilst it might lead to lower car usage, it certainly doesn't lead to lower car ownership. Because people had cars anyway. And then the fourth age of the car, this is a quote from Eric Pickles from a couple of years ago. I sense this is where we're at now, that the Conservatives don't want us messing with your car. They're actually saying people's right to drive is quite important, the car industry is quite important to our national economy, and we're back into the era of having to accommodate cars in our cities. The extent to which they're growing, as I say at the beginning, is a moot point. It may well be that we've reached, through other things like insurance premiums for young people, the point at which car ownership isn't actually growing that rapidly. But we are certainly beyond that stage where we're saying, let's change the city to reduce car ownership. And so there are a number of implications for that. And so we've done a lot of work on Oxford over the last few years. And one of the issues with somewhere like Oxford is that it has nowhere to grow. And so what happens in Oxford is if it's got to the edge of its green belt, it's rapidly growing in terms of its economy. The only way to actually accommodate its people is to put them beyond the green belt. And so all the towns around the edge of its green belt are growing quite rapidly because, of course, you can't possibly build within its green belt. That wouldn't be allowed. And so the result is this, which is you get you generate huge car movements because you have all these people living in Bicester and Witney and Abingdon and so on, and there are no public transport because there's not enough of them to support public transport, so they have to drive back across the green belt. So the green belt is a huge car generator. The existence of the green belt is what creates longer car journeys, and actually those focus on the historic town of Oxford. And so the green belt is causing cars to kill Oxford. This is not an argument which the Campaign for Rural England tends to accept. But one of the things that we did, of course, as part of the Wolfson Prize thing on garden cities was to say, take this town, we called it Uster, and actually rather than doing that, you could do this within the green belt and build on 6 or 7% of the green belt and create these urban extensions which look like this, which could then be connected by a tram back into the middle of the town. So actually you could create a form of development which is much more sustainable, much more compact, based upon public transport, but you had to build within the green belt to do that, which of course is contentious. So this was our attempt to apply that to Oxford. So there's Oxford at the moment with its floodplain. That's the diagram how it might be applied to somewhere like to Oxford. And also we've been doing this more recently, looking around the station in Oxford and looking about how you might prevent cars coming through the station into the town centre, but actually look at putting a tram into Oxford to do that. Now people say Oxford's too small to have a tram. You don't have trams in the same towns the size of Oxford, and I'll show you at the end an example of a town which has trams, which is no bigger than Oxford. And then this is the social city, so this is Oxford and its surroundings, and the big cross to the middle is the rail lines. And so you actually start to focus this development of the region around Oxford, with that half the growth going around Oxford itself and the other half going in the satellite towns, and linking it all together with public transport. This is what we need to do to stop cars from killing our historic cities, and this is a potential expansion on the edge of Oxford. If we come down a level from the macro to the sort of neighbourhood level, the next thing that the cars have done to our cities is to ruin their permeability. So you might recognise this. That's Anfield football ground there. This is just a bit of bylaw terracing. So this was built in an age when no residents there had a car. And a lot of roads, all the white stuff on that is roads. Very permeable, very based upon, all those streets going up there would have been lined with shops. Very sort of walkable neighbourhood. The next level, if you go on to our sort of the age of the car, anyone recognise this? This is actually North Nottingham. Some amazing garden city stuff, North Nottingham, unsung. And again, look at this. This is car ownership's starting up now, so people are starting to think about cars. Lots of crescents and lots of big geometric shapes. Still incredibly good permeability. I mean, some cul-de-sacs, but generally very easy to get around. Now, a modern development, these are all the same scale, these maps, by the way. They're all exactly the same scale. Here's a modern development. This is Solihull, I think. And we had a thing called DB32, which is one of those urban idiot things. DB32 said we will have distributed roads and so on, and we won't have any frontage access on all roads except for the most minor. And so you end up with this cul-de-sac type layout with roads which take through traffic, like the one at the bottom having no frontage access, just back gardens, and then this dendritic structure of cul-de-sacs so that no one could possibly walk around these places because you have to walk around huge distances to get through, so everyone drives. And this is the worst type of environment created to cater for the car, and it generates car ownership because of the way it's designed. This is one of our master plans who I probably should remain nameless at the moment, for a new garden city, which tries to get back to the Nottinghams of this world, that sort of Nottingham example of something which was more garden city in layout, but actually based upon a permeable network of walkable streets. And we can, in the way we design this stuff, find ways of creating a much more walkable neighbourhoods rather than designing for the car. This is another historic city. This is the historic city of Bordeaux in France. And I put them in, I was looking through some other slides, and I came across these. They have to go in. They're not directly relevant to what I'm talking about, but they seem worth it. I was in a museum called Arc en Rêve, which is in the middle of Bordeaux, and bought this book by Rem Koolhaas, and they had these pictures in it, and I presumed it was a American city until I saw that all the signs were in French. And then the cousin that we were staying with saying, oh, that's just around the corner. And we were staying in Bordeaux with them. And this is the edge of Bordeaux. And this is what happens when you have entirely car-dominated retailing. And the way these work, actually, is you can see these big signs at the back. That's the entrance to the car park. And so you have to put these really big signs at the back so that people in the cars can find out their way into the car park. And you create this stuff, this sort of strip mall type developments, which is just, awful. So this is what happened in French cities. This is what happens around the edge of the cities. This is a I can't remember where this is. I think it might be a Ben Hamilton Bailey slide as well. This is what happens when we allow the traffic into our cities, and then we think we have to deal with it all. So we have to kettle the pedestrians onto the pavement so they can't get run over. And we have to marshal the way they go through this. And we have to put how many numbers of traffic lights on that thing just to make sure everyone's quite clear where they're allowed to go and when. And there's some quite nice historic buildings in the background there. And that was probably quite a nice space at one time. And we just completely ruin it. And actually, taking all that away and let the traffic sort itself out gets us back to that original slide of London. That's the idea that you might do in terms of shared space. So this is my historic city that I started with, and this is also Ben Hamilton Bailey graphic. This is what we got to in order to deal with that. I particularly like the site of outstanding quaintness, which is the sign at the beginning with the National Trust symbol underneath it. But yeah, this is what you have to do if you try and deal with cars by engineering and highways terms, and this is where you get death by car, or at least by highway engineer. In terms of what we do about it, this is a modest table, but it took a year to negotiate with the highway engineers in Manchester in about 1992, 93. And what it is from the Hulme Guide to Development. And the first column is High Street through Hulme. And we sat down and we negotiated with the highway engineers huge sort of arguments about how wide a high street would be, because they were still very much in that mind of the dual carriageways in Cambridge Street and so on. And we got it to 17 metres wide. Sorry, 21 metres wide for Stretford Road. And this is Stretford Road, by the way, at the bottom. That's why the picture's there. Don't get distracted by the penguins. They're not relevant to this photograph. But in the background, you can see a design institute, and this is the pedestrian route going through Hulme. And we wanted to reopen it and put the road back through. And here's what it looks like today in one of my drawings. And it's 21 metres wide, and it's got cycle lanes on it, and it's got footpaths, and it's got street trees, and it's got a little bit of that traffic vitality that one got in Jaipur, but not too much, because obviously you don't want too much. And this is a street again, and actually you take the traffic off this and it doesn't work. It's about accommodating the traffic and being relaxed about how people negotiate things, how people negotiate their abilities. This is the town which is no bigger than Oxford, which has a tram system, which is Grenoble in France. Grenoble actually has 5 tram lines. And no bigger than Oxford, weaves their way through a historic city, as that table at the beginning showed, incredibly efficient way of taking very large numbers of people through a very tight urban environment. And it is the solution to our historic towns. The solution is also to be more relaxed about cars. This is Poynton, just near Manchester, which is an early shared space scheme done by, again, Ben Hamilton Bailey. And I've got a final slide, which if this will work, which shows the results of that, this is in Holland. This is shared space at work. No kettling, no fences, children bouncing around in the background, and people crossing the road without looking. It's just quite interesting. They're not worrying about cars. Actually, when you look at them, there is a moment of eye contact. So each of them glances, eye contact with the driver, you've seen me, it's fine, I'll walk in front of you. And the car therefore slows down and goes, this is what we need to do. So a combination of trams and this type of thing will sort out the problems we have in our historic towns and cities in terms of traffic. What we don't want to get hung up with is the idea of driverless cars, which is this is a driverless car from the 1950s. It's not a new idea. It's been around for a long time. And people get completely hung up on this is going to solve everything. It won't. We need to have very practical solutions to how our historic cities accommodate the car. Accommodate it by bringing it in and controlling it, but not as a sort of highway engineering exercise. So thank you very much.